This is The Rounds Table.
Welcome back, Rounds Table listeners. This is John Fralick, one of your hosts. Today, we're going to do a solo episode. This is the caffeinated coffee consumption or abstinence to reduce atrial fibrillation, the DECAF randomized control trial. This was published JAMA November 2025 by Wong et al. So what was the research question? Well, does consuming caffeinated coffee have a beneficial, detrimental, or neutral effect on the risk of recurrent atrial fibrillation? So why does this matter? Well, AFib is common, and there's been a long-standing dogma that caffeine is pro-arrhythmic. And historically, recommendations were made for patients to reduce their coffee intake to minimize the effects of atrial fibrillation. But coffee is also delicious, and recently there was the CRAVE study, which showed that coffee consumption was not associated with premature atrial contractions, which can trigger AFib episodes. And so the current study set out to test the long-standing practice and try and answer once and for all if caffeinated coffee consumption is associated with AFib or not. So what was the design here? This was an investigator-initiated, prospective, open-label, international, multi-center randomized controlled trial with patients recruited across the United States, Australia, and Canada. For the patient population, there were adults aged 21 or older with sustained AFib or a flutter with a history of AFib, with a planned direct current electrical cardioversion, and coffee consumption of at least 1 cup a day or more sometime in the past 5 years. Patients were excluded if life expectancy was less than 6 months, if there was an inability to adhere to coffee abstinence or consumption. I think I would have been excluded from the study due to my inability to not drink coffee, but I also don't have AFib. If they had AFib ablation or CV surgery within 3 months, and they were excluded if they were pregnant or had a desire to get pregnant within 6 months. So what was the intervention? Randomization took place only after sustained successful cardioversion. Patients were then randomized 1-to-1 to either caffeinated coffee consumption or abstinence from coffee and caffeine. If randomized to the coffee consumption arm, patients were encouraged to drink at least 1 cup of coffee a day, but to not intentionally increase or decrease consumption of coffee or other caffeinated products. In the no coffee group, patients were encouraged to completely abstain from coffee, including decaffeinated products. Follow-up took place up to 6 months. For the outcomes, the primary outcome was AFib or A-flutter detection lasting 30 seconds or longer, and all had to be confirmed on either an ECG, a wearable ECG monitor, or an ICD. There were a bunch of secondary outcomes, including recurrence of AFib and A-flutter separately, and any adverse events. So who was included? Well, just over 1,900 patients were screened, but ultimately about 1,700 did not meet criteria. In particular, a quarter of patients screened were not willing to abstain from coffee. Ultimately, 100 patients were randomized to coffee consumption and 100 patients were randomized to the abstinence group. The average age was between 68 to 70 years. Most patients were men and most were Caucasian. Hypertension, OSA, cardiomyopathy, and diabetes were common between the two groups. About 10% in both groups had a prior stroke. All patients had persistent AFib leading up to the time of cardioversion. The mean CHA2DS2-VASc score was 2.5. And what did they find? So first, at baseline, coffee intake was similar between the two groups. In the drink coffee group, consumption did not significantly change after randomization. In the caffeine abstinence group, patients reduced their coffee intake from 7 cups per week with an interquartile range of 7 to 18 to 0 cups per week with an interquartile range of 0 to 2. This was also maintained over the duration of the study. So for that primary outcome, at 6 months, 47 patients, or 47% in the caffeine group, had recurrent AFib. This was compared with 64 patients, or 64% in the abstinence group. Overall, adverse rates were similar between the two groups. What were some of the limitations here? Well, lots of patients were excluded prior to randomization, and overall, this was a small sample size. All patients enrolled had persistent AFib, and so if caffeine affects those patients with paroxysmal AFib differently for some reason, these data can't really be applied to the impact of caffeine or abstinence. So what's the take home? In patients with persistent AFib undergoing cardioversion, consumption of caffeinated coffee compared with abstinence was associated with a lower recurrence of AFib or A-flutter. Is this practice changing? Yeah, I think it is. To poorly paraphrase the French, let them drink coffee. Well, that just about wraps up today's episode, but before we go, the good stuff. For you space fans, the CBC has an article that was pretty cool. Turns out a certain type of moss was able to live for 9 months in the harshness of outer space, outside of the International Space Station. Researchers hope that this will translate into eventually allowing plants to grow in places like the Moon and Mars. No comment in the article about whether or not they anticipate being able to grow coffee on the Moon or Mars anytime soon. All right, thanks a lot for listening. We'll talk to you guys later. The Rounds Table is hosted online at medicinepods.com, your one-stop source for comprehensive internal medicine education and evidence-based medicine resources. We can also be found on all of your favorite streaming services. You can also follow us on Instagram, LinkedIn, and X.